For our study tonight, we're going to stay entirely in Psalm 63, so I encourage you to open your Bible in the pew. I'll also have the verses up on the slides, but I've always found that it helps me more when I'm in the Word and just seeing that text there. I love the Psalms. I think it might be one of my favorite books in the Bible. And, David has done so much to write of songs and prayers and just the way that he communicates with God. I think it's a treasure that we can read those things and learn from him about how to seek God. And whenever I find that I'm having anxiety or worry or just struggling, I turn to the Psalms and it just lifts me up. And this week has just been one of those weeks where I've had a psalm on my mind. I think more modern day, I've had a song on my mind. Keith Lancaster's Praise and Harmony group has a song called Better Than Life that takes the words of this psalm and puts it into a 4-part harmony, and it's a beautiful song. But I want to walk us through this psalm tonight, kind of with the perspective of thinking about our relationship with God, and especially placing emphasis on, I guess, our attitude in the midst of struggle, because we face things every day. And as I've faced struggles this week that are different than what you've faced, I find myself turning to the Psalms and realizing that what I'm facing this week is nothing compared to what David has faced in his life. And we're going to look at some of the background before we begin about this psalm. But this is a psalm of trust that David's written, and if you're unaware, there are lots of genres of psalms. Genres are like types of or categories of psalms. This is a psalm of trust. And just to briefly review that genre with you, psalms of trust are often characterized more by their content than by their structure. Generally, we noticed a few things in these types of psalms. We notice an assertion of trust in God despite what's going on, despite enemies and despite threats. We'll sometimes notice striking metaphors that show an intimate awareness of God's presence. In a lot of psalms of trust, you'll hear things like, God is my refuge, He's my shepherd, my light, my rock, my help, things like that. And then perhaps most beautifully, we'll find that there is a moving submission in the writer to an everlasting hope. And I think that that's something we can really drive home tonight as we think about this through the lens of our relationship with God through the difficulties of life. Now, in your Bible, you'll notice that in the subtext of this psalm's title, we're told that David wrote it when he was in the wilderness of Judah. And there are kind of two camps of thought relating to what time period this might be. One of those is that it's written when David was in this wilderness period before he took the throne in Israel. And that was, of course, during that time of turmoil when King Saul was hunting him. And we know there are a lot of psalms written about that point in his life. Some people also think that this could instead be about David's flight from Jerusalem during the rebellion of Absalom. And we could read a little bit about that in 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 28. I kind of lean towards this latter interpretation for this psalm. And I think verse 11 of this psalm, which we'll look at later when he mentions his kingship, I think really kind of pulls that out, since the first interpretation would be before he was even king. But we learn from 2 Samuel 15 and 28 that the wilderness David entered was the Jordan Valley, a northern part of Judah near Jericho. And that kind of matches with this title that's given, that this was in the wilderness of Judah. So we have just these beautiful words, and we're gonna kind of read this in sections as we go through. And we'll start with the first 5 verses. David writes, O God, you are my God. Early will I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh longs for you in a dry and thirsty land where there is no water. So I've looked for you in the sanctuary to see your power and your glory. And behold, your loving kindness is better than life. My lips shall praise you. Verse 4, thus I will bless you while I live, and I will lift up my hands in your name. And my soul shall be satisfied as with marrow and fatness, and my mouth shall praise you with joyful lips. He begins with this statement of relationship that is the heart of covenant. First, we notice that he's seeking God early in the morning. And this covenant relationship goes from the patriarchs to present day, from Genesis chapter 17 and verse 8 all the way now to Hebrews 8 and verse 10. And we see David says, you are my God. David proclaims his allegiance to the great I am, and he acknowledges that there is but one God who is sovereign. You'll notice that he writes, early will I seek you. Some translations say earnestly in the place of that word. Bible scholar Alec Motyer, he uses the phrase in his devotional translation of this psalm. He says, as day dawns, I will seek you. I think there's kind of a twofold meaning here. This idea of rising early is used as a metaphor for zeal. Coming before God early is the first thing on David's mind, even as he wakes in this desert wilderness. It is a priority of his day. And though he's thirsting physically, his soul is thirsting spiritually, demanding a satisfaction in spiritual service that starts early in the day. And if you think about him wandering through the wilderness, and what a challenging plight that would be. I mean, I can't make it a couple hours without my water bottle. But like he's been in this wilderness for a long time, running for his life. But who does he seek? He seeks God. God, through Jeremiah, he uses this sense of early morning to illustrate a similar idea. In Jeremiah chapter 7 and verse 25, we find it says, since the day that your fathers came out of the land of Egypt until this day, I have even sent to you all my servants the prophets, daily rising up early and sending them. It's Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 25. This phrase indicates the persistence and the urgency of God's message that was coming through his prophets. Adam Clarke writes on this text, what first lays hold of the heart in the morning is likely what will occupy our hearts for the rest of the day. First impressions are the most durable because there's not a multitude of ideas that we have to drive them out or to prevent them from becoming deeply fixed in our hearts. I think how true that is, that the importance of starting off your day right. This morning's moments can set the tone for the entire day. Do we long and thirst for God in the morning like David? Notice how intentional he is to seek God as he rises for this new day. He possesses a joyful reliance despite the physical struggles that are sure to ail him throughout the day. Like, who knows where this was in his journey, but maybe he's been out there for days and he knows, I woke up, I'm in the same plight. Nothing but challenges are going to befall me again today, but still he's seeking God through this dry and thirsty land. There's no desert in his heart here. Prayer is the sustenance he needs, and he is prepared to strengthen his relationship with God. So he moves on in verses 2 and 3 to kind of make a reflection of the past. He's just noticed his present situation, and now he's moving backwards. In present emergencies, he recalls these past experiences and memories to help fortify his mind. When he experienced this kind of longing before, what did he do? He sought God in the sanctuary, and he was met with God's power and with God's glory. And David is asking that this remedy be the same thing now for him in the wilderness. Notice in verse 3, this outpouring. I love this verse. I think it's one of the most beautiful verses in this psalm. Because your loving kindness is better than life, my lips shall praise you. Lord, your love is better than anything I can experience in this life. A similar idea is found in Psalm 13 and verse 5. And there it talks about mercy. And I think this loving kindness is kind of leaning into a loyal love. In Psalm 13 and verse 5, it says, "But I have trusted in your mercy, and my heart shall rejoice in your salvation." And there I think the writer is kind of leaning into the hope of a promise found in this loyal love that the Lord bestows upon those who are in covenant relationship with him. In thinking on the past, David knows that God's love and mercy are going to remain the same in the present today. And he praises God for this assurance. You know, sometimes when we get bogged down, I think it's hard for us to say to God, your love is better than life. When we get lost in the burdens of the things going on around us, when we lose focus on our heavenly citizenship, we often seek things to satisfy ourselves in the moment. And we want negative feelings to fade, so we do the things that we know will make us feel better, even if that happiness is only for a fleeting, temporary moment. But the true cure is to find joy in seeking God, like David does. And he clings to these memories of God's faithfulness in his darkest moments, and he's able to carry on. And I wonder, do we value the love of God in that way? Are we letting its power saturate our lives to cover our worries with praise instead of always resulting in an attitude of fear or of apathy or indifference? Behold his power and his glory. I think David, we can look to him because he has such a deep understanding of the true joys of life. His relationship with God far outweighed anything physical that could have happened to him. And if the love of God becomes more precious to me than my own life, if I can say this, that God, your loving kindness is better than life, then how in the world could I ever be indifferent? How in the world could I ever be apathetic to the problems around me that need change, that need resolve? This reminds me of Matthew chapter 6 and 21, where Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The things that we feed our heart are what we learn to love and long for. And if we let days go by without speaking to God, our Father, then we're treating the Lord with a bit of mute indifference. And, you know, if I can go through each morning with no thought of God's provision for my day, then I'm missing the devotion and the gratitude that David is encouraging me to use in this psalm. And so maybe if you're reflecting and you're thinking, man, I don't know that I think about God a lot in the morning when I'm getting ready for my day. That's a discipline. It's a practice to form our mornings in that way, to be intentional about it. I don't think David came into this way by accident. You know, I don't know that he's necessarily intentionally teaching us to be intentional in this psalm, but I think we can learn from his life and from the way that he's written this psalm that he was intentional. As we conclude the first half of this psalm with verses 4 and 5, it kind of leans into a scene of dawn. David moves from the past now to talk about the future and what may come for him. And I think that word thus in verse 4 kind of signals that because of these things he's saying. He's saying, because of these things that I know about you, Lord, because of what I've experienced with you, I will trust in you. He says, I will bless you. I will lift my hands in praise, and I know my soul shall be satisfied. Sometimes that phrase of blessing the Lord can be a little bit confusing because we're always asking God to bless us in different ways. But when we ask God to bless someone, usually I think what we're meaning is, God, please consider this person's needs and meet them if it be your will. You know, we're seeking for him to kind of respond in a certain way. But similarly, when the psalmist writes of blessing the Lord, I think he's considering the Lord's excellencies and his glories, and then he's responding appropriately with wonder and adoration. So he's kind of doing that other side of it, blessing the name of the Lord. Praise, of course, is the natural response when we acknowledge God's goodness toward us. He says in verse 5 that his soul is satisfied as with marrow and fatness, and his mouth will praise God with joyful lips. There is a rich fullness to be acquired when we surrender ourselves to God. And sometimes I find myself not feeling that fullness. But every time I find myself not feeling that fullness, I examine where I am and I realize I'm not yielding. I'm not surrendering. And maybe you've felt that too. But when we give God praise without reservation, without regard to circumstance, as David has done here when he's hungering and thirsting in the wilderness, our souls can be satisfied in his love, just like David's. And so we move into the latter half of the psalm. We'll read verses 6 through 11 now. David continues, "When I remember you on my bed, I meditate on you in the night watches. Because you have been my help, therefore in the shadow of your wings I will rejoice." Verse 8, "My soul follows close behind you, and your right hand upholds me. But those who seek my life to destroy it shall go into the lower parts of the earth. They shall fall by the sword, and they shall be a portion for jackals. But the king shall rejoice in God. Everyone who swears by him shall glory, but the mouth of those who speak lies shall be stopped." So going back to verses 6 and 7, here David is moving into an evening reflection. And he kind of is talking about the past again. He's reflecting on something that's happened before. Just as he arose in the morning to seek God, he turns to meditation now as he prepares for sleep at the close of his day. I love that his days are bookended with praise and reflection. And I wonder just how amazing our attitudes would be if we woke up feeling that way and we ended the day feeling that way. Maybe our dreams would carry into some encouraging things, and then wake up feeling similarly. But this night watch that he's talking about, he's alert, he's vigilant because of what's going on around him. That's a slow burn. You think about being in the wilderness all alone, and the sights that you would see. This is kind of a mundane task. But David found purpose in this time where nothing seemed to be going on. He found purpose for spiritual things. Instead of focusing on the boredom of the moment, he meditated and he lifted his thoughts upward toward God. Surely we all have times in our day when we're waiting for something to happen. I wonder, do our thoughts naturally lead us to reflect on our gratitude toward God in those moments? That's another kind of disposition that you can train yourself just in an attitude of gratitude, to think more about those things in the mundane moments of life. We're usually pretty good about praying in the heat of the day when challenges and tasks are aplenty in the valley of life. But praise should also be on our tongues when we return to those flat plains, when we return to those times when everything is just kind of day to day. Sleep and the night watch are not of themselves unique, but David is creating some special and unique moments here by remembering the help that God has provided him in times past. He says in verse 7, "Because you've been my help, in the shadow of your wings I will rejoice." It's so wonderful that he has that experience to rely upon from before in his present distress. In verse 8, David moves his meditation forward again into the present, and this time he speaks of the partnership and connection that we all experience with God. Our souls should be joined together with him, letting no space come between ourselves and the Master. David, he trusts in God's provision. He says, "My soul follows close behind you, and your right hand upholds me." It is that strength that's getting him through this wilderness journey. This reminds me of Exodus 15 and verse 6, where Moses, in his song, he sings of God's right hand. As God has freed the Israelites from Egyptian bondage and kept them safe across the Red Sea. That's Exodus 15 and verse 6. It's the same right hand that protects David and even us today. Do we trust in God's provision for us when those worries and those what-ifs and those doubts and anxieties begin to cloud our judgment? Are we able to give those to God and cast our cares upon Him so that we can allow our soul to follow closely to Him? Sometimes in those busy seasons, we forget God. And, instead of following closely, sometimes we leave Him behind because things are well. But we need God even when life is good, because we know it's all good things that come from Him. When we deceive ourselves into thinking that, then we've forgotten that it's His loving kindness that's even made it so for us. And so there's reason for praise to be on our lips in all the seasons of life. David is saying here that even in these mundane hours of the night before he drifts off to sleep, he places his protection into the hand of the Lord. And that had to be kind of a fearful time for him. Because, if he's alone and he has to go to sleep to recharge his energy, he has no human there to guard him. So he's got to trust in God and trust that the Lord will protect him and keep him safe. He acknowledges that every good thing in his life, even those moments where nothing seems to be happening, should declare praise unto the Maker. And I think that's a lesson for us today too. That even if we feel stagnant, we feel like we're not growing, or we're struggling with some change and it seems like we're just kind of bumping along, there's reasons to praise God in those moments, because if we stick with Him, hopefully things will improve. Lastly, in verses 9 through 11, David concludes his psalm by entrusting his ultimate future to whatever God may have in store. David's strong relationship with God did not take away his present problems. That kind of makes me think of Paul and how he had that thorn in his side. Like, he did great things for the Lord, but he had to endure some earthly affliction. We all have earthly affliction we face, regardless of the strength of our relationship with God. But being with God here, David, he was still in the wilderness. He was still sought by people who wanted to harm him. But he trusted in God to deal with his enemies. And with David being the anointed king of Israel, we know that God would preserve his life in this way so long as he remained faithful, because he was to be king and have this earthly reign. And it's in verse 11, as we read, that David kind of speaks of his kingship in third person. I think it's that reflection that makes me think that this is of the time when he was fleeing from Absalom and that rebellion. But whether you interpret this psalm as being before or during David's kingship, again, it's this statement that declares the daring faith that he had in God to pull him through. And in contrast, those who, as he says in verse 11, those who speak lies and those who don't trust in God, that's something that's going to be stopped. Because we know that justice will prevail, that God will be victorious. The path of falsehood will end. But the path of truth and the path of trust has future glory. So in this psalm, David, he paints a beautiful word picture of what it means to intentionally seek God at all parts of our day, in both the beginning and in the end, and in all the moments in between. And he began in verse 1 with this acknowledgement of his personal relationship with God. And then he establishes that he will earnestly seek Him in all things. And it's with that earnest zeal that David can confidently profess the demise of his enemies here at the end of the psalm. He puts his ultimate trust of all of his life circumstances into the hands of God. And it's that trust that's able to help him carry on. And so if you ever get to feeling like you've got those enemies swirling around, and you're struggling to break through, or it just seems like the circumstances around you are not beneficial where you are. I think this psalm is one that's really encouraging for us to read. It can help to build those words of praise and those words of intentionality in our quiet moments. Fellowship with God is something that we have to cultivate, right? It's a relationship. We can't just expect we're baptized, we have a relationship, and then that's it. Same thing with our relationships here. We can't just expect to call each other brother and sister and then never speak to each other, never hang out, never build or grow that relationship. It doesn't work that way. But as David said, he said, "Early will I seek you." He understood that building that relationship with God was something he had to do. He had to go to him. We're going to have to put some effort into our relationship with God as well if you feel like maybe that's something that has been struggling. But know that the hard work that you put in of studying, of praying, of meditating on good things, all of that hard work can do amazing things in your life. But even more than that, it does amazing things to the lives of the people around you, because then you're able to radiate the light of God, the light of Christ. A man with deep trust in God shines forth an example of steadfastness in a world of decaying confidence, where truth always seems to be in question. Somebody who's steadfast and has something to hold on to, that makes people go, I wonder about that person. A woman who has praise on her lips all the time, who has a good word for everyone, she shares God's loving kindness with everyone she meets. And that's a blessing to everyone around you. So if you ever feel yourself drifting or unsure of how to get out of that rut, talk to God and speak to somebody who you think is a strong Christian, because they might be able to help you in that restoration. Restoration always starts with the first step. You have to acknowledge that and then move forward. If David had stopped caring about his situation, just given up in the wilderness, he probably would have never made it out. But instead, he was intentional about remaining close in communion with God during that drought, and it worked wonders for him. And I know it can do the same for us today, because the loving kindness of our God is better than life.